Thanks so much for the introduction, Sarah. I'm really excited to be doing this. So most of what I'm going to be doing rather is obviously going to be a demonstration, but of course I will be happy to hear your thoughts as well. And I thought we could actually start a little bit. I definitely have a lot of thoughts and associations about herring, but I'd be curious to hear if anyone else has either strong feelings, good memories, feelings of revulsion. Any thoughts about herring at all? If you'd like to either type them in or say something about them. I know it's a strong and polarizing food, so. Shy. Oh, okay. Let's see. All right, Zoe has never had it. That's totally reasonable. I get that. I didn't really grow up with it either. And yeah, Yitz mentions that the smell is a big thing. It's very pungent and it tastes like it smells. So it's quite a forceful food, and that can be really really overcoming before you sort of get to know it. All right, any other thoughts? Yeah. So Leora mentions something that I think is a common experience. One thing that I'm going to mention briefly. So she says that, or Leora says that I expected to dislike it, but when I tried it, I actually really liked it. So I think that this sort of fishy, salty flavor. Oh, that's just the text. Okay. The sort of fishy, salty flavor is something that that Americans are really not familiar with. And so it can be really scary at first, but sometimes when you try it, it turns out that it actually can work well if it's in the right place. All right, any last thoughts before I give a little bit of introduction and we can get started? Okay, great. So I want to share a little bit about my thoughts about herring. My first experience, which I think might be a kind of common one, at least if not so much the specifics, but just kind of the general feel, is that I was at a Russian New Year's party. And if you're not familiar with Russian New Year's, they're basically they're very elaborate celebrations. So you don't eat until after midnight. You have the main course after midnight. But once that happens, there's obviously like a ton of food, different like pickled things and meats and a lot of good stuff. And so one of these specialties that's often eaten around New Year's is called Saryodka pod shuboy, I think is the Russian. It literally means herring under a fur coat. And basically the fur coat is it's a few layers of like mayonnaise and chopped up carrots and beets and potatoes, and then the herring. And so when I first tried this, I was absolutely repulsed by it. I think it's something about the combination of the beet and the herring, just like really, it's just like a very strong flavor, and I was very much not vibing with it. But sort of as I came to have it more, as I sort of had it a few more times, I really started in different configurations without the beets. I really started to develop an appreciation for it. And I think that herring for me is something that I really associate not just with Jewishness or with my rather particular, Ashkenazi, sort of the Eastern European roots of one side of my family, but with a very particular view on that. And so that's in America, as I see it, herring is basically like one of the things that we consider a Jewish food, which of course is what we consider Jewish food in America generally, or what is generally considered Jewish food, is obviously not everything that Jews all around the world eat, but is usually just sort of considered to be a very specific slice of what Ashkenazi Jews from Eastern Europe ate. And so, those sorts of things, like herring, are thought of as like Jewish food. But as I've become more familiar over the past few years with Eastern European food, Russian food, Polish food, Ukrainian in general, it's clear that like a lot of what we consider to be like Jewish food in America is really just eaten by everyone in Eastern Europe. So I live in a Russian neighborhood. I went to my Russian grocery store today, and they have this big spread. And what do they have there? They have pickles and like sauerkraut or coleslaw. You can buy like a smoked mackerel, just like you can get at Murray's. You can get things that look a lot like brisket. You can get tongue, which, you know, you can get a tongue sandwich in Jewish delis, but not at like barbecues, for example. There's also something that the Poles call smalets, and that's lard, which is very similar to obviously the Jewish schmaltz, which is not lard, for obvious reasons. And so really a lot of these foods that I grew up with as kind of Jewish foods, I've come to realize are actually shared by Jews and non-Jews alike in just a particular region of Eastern Europe. And herring in particular is very popular throughout Europe. So Krakow, the city in Poland, right by the Jewish quarter rather, there's actually a restaurant called the Herring Embassy, which only serves herring. I think herring, maybe like pickles and vodka, but those are sort of the three things you get. They have many different kinds of herring. When you go there after your night out, you get like a plate of herring, a shot of vodka, and it's wonderful. So, you know, herring is something that's popular really throughout Europe. Oh, what else do you need? Yeah, exactly. Right, so it's something that's very popular throughout Eastern Europe, and also Northern Europe, like much of Europe, but I think America has really sort of lost this flavor. We don't really have this fishy, salty flavor profile, and that leads to sort of the reaction that a lot of you had and that I first had when I tried it, which is that it's, you know, can seem kind of gross. And so I see pickling herring. First of all, you know, it's obviously, I think that pickling things yourself and making food yourself, even if you can buy it in a plastic container, is a good way to sort of not necessarily just get a bit of self-reliance, but learn to sort of be more connected to the food process. But it's also a way of rediscovering, for me at least, a sense of the Jewish culture and folkways that really respect the context in which my ancestors grew up, right? So it wasn't just, you know, obviously the Jews sort of had their world and their societies, and the non-Jews often lived separately, but there was a lot of intertwining, and a lot of the cultural aspects, including the food aspects, were really quite similar. Plus, it's very cheap. So I went to the store, and I got you can get an entire herring for $3, and that'll be good for a couple of solid meals. So that brings us to the herring recipes that I'm going to prepare today. Before I move on with that, does anyone have any questions or thoughts they want to share about, you know, herring or Ashkenazi food? If anyone else has had this experience, I had this experience of going to parts of Eastern Europe, and it really felt like home in a way that, you know, going to other Jewish communities in Europe doesn't, because everything just felt so familiar. Right. So A asks, yeah. So herring versus whitefish versus other similar fish. I don't really know too much about all the different types of fish. I think herring is pretty particular in that it always comes sort of salty and briny, whereas other whitefish you can kind of just get whole. The other thing about herring that is sort of particular to it that I know of is that it goes bad really, really quickly in a way that I don't think is true of other whitefish. And that, I think, is one reason why pickling has become sort of a common way to deal with it. And yeah, as Zoe says, yeah, so I am going to be pickling the herring today, and time permitting, I'm also going to be preparing another herring recipe. And yeah, that is a very common way of preparing it. Like I said, in the Russian grocery stores near me, you can just go and you can buy little pickled herring in a plastic container. It's probably about, like, I don't know, $6 or $7, and it'll have, you know, less than a herring. So this is less than one herring. So this is sort of a much cheaper way of doing that. Yeah. So that brings me to sort of the progenitor of what really got me interested in herring. And that was this wonderful restaurant in Lviv, which is a city in Western Ukraine. The Yiddish name is Lemberg. If any of you know that, it's right in the heartland of Galicia. And there's this wonderful Jewish restaurant called Cafe Jerusalem, led by this Jewish Ukrainian woman named Lola Landa, who has gone all around Western Ukraine. First of all, giving sort of classes on sort of traditional Jewish food, which is how I first encountered her. But also going around collecting recipes from various grandmothers, and so she really has done the work to make this authentic, this sort of authentic restaurant, which really captures Ukrainian or sort of Jewish cuisine from that part of the world, and in a way which is very important, I think, that doesn't really feel fake or kitschy. Because if you go to a lot of these restaurants, they have like pictures of rabbis on the wall, and they have the Barry sisters sort of pumping in. And sometimes the waiters will dress up with payas and everything, and they'll have Israeli wine, and it's really too much. But this feels like really authentic and really integrated into sort of modern day Ukrainian life, and not fake, in a way that I really appreciate. So this restaurant is great. If anyone gets to go there, I would really recommend it. It's fantastic. So today we're going to be doing at least one, hopefully two recipes that I learned when I was visiting Lololanda in Ukraine. Oh, I should also mention, if you're interested in this restaurant in particular, Emma Claire Foley and I have written an article about it, which I will link here. There's also a few other recipes in the article. So if you're interested in learning more about this food in general, please check it out. Right, so we're going to be doing just a basic pickled herring. And then if we have time afterwards, which I think we should, we're going to be doing a dish called Forshmak, which is very popular, particularly around Odessa, which is sort of a port city not far from Crimea on the Black Sea shore of Ukraine. So there, that's sort of, so Odessa traditionally has had like a lot of Jews. I think it was maybe something like 40, almost 50% Jewish, especially before the war. And even after the war, there were still a lot of Jews left. And sort of the Odessan archetype is really the Jew. And so when we think of sort of the old country, I think American Ashkenazi Jews often have this conception of, like they hated us, everything was bad. But really, it's a lot more complicated. Like I mentioned before, they were really integrated. And Odessa, even if it's sort of appropriative of its Jewish heritage in a way, or its Jewish sort of population, it's really proud of it and really identifies with it in a way that I think is a lot more complex than we usually give it credit for. So this Forshmak, which is a common appetizer that you find a lot in Odessa, that's going to be ground herring with apples and onions and a bunch of other good stuff. All right, so let's get started with filleting the herring. I'm going to go get that. And while I'm doing this, again, if you have any questions or thoughts, feel free to let me know. But this is sort of a really nice and easy recipe. And honestly, if you don't live, in far South Brooklyn or Forest Hills, probably the most time-consuming and difficult part is going to be tracking down a fresh herring to buy, because it's usually not so easy to get them in a lot of non-specialty supermarkets, or supermarkets that aren't targeted for Russian audiences. So here's our herring. She's a beauty. I bought this morning. As I mentioned, herring goes bad very easily. So you're really going to want to pickle it as soon as possible once you get it. So I'm going to show you how to fillet this. It's really not that bad. There's just a couple of tricks that you got to know. So the first thing that I'm going to do is cut off the tail and the head, like a little bit past the gills. But again, it doesn't really matter. You can sort of do wherever and always chop a bit more off later. So the way that it gets sold over here is that the guts have already been taken out and they leave sort of this empty cavity. So what we're going to want to do is, with our knife, just sort of make a slit over here in the bottom of the belly where it's not open, just so this sort of goes all the way through this opening. All right, everyone see that? I just sort of cut over here. And then we're going to want to lay it flat. Essentially what we're going to do is spatchcocking it. If anyone's ever spatchcocked a chicken, sort of split it open and remove the backbone. So we could just yank out the backbone, but we really don't want to do that because it's going to take a lot of the meat out with it. Right, this is sort of it's pretty delicate. It has the tendency to get mushy pretty easily, and we really want to try and save as much as we can. So what we're going to do is we're going to sort of press down And make sure it's split open. Right, and really just sort of finesse it out, sort of push it out a little bit at a time. And you'll be able to feel it. You'll be able to feel the backbone coming out. But really, we're going to want to just do it slowly, take our time. Don't rush the backbone out. We don't want to press it too hard and take all the meat out. We're really just going to press it down slowly. And as we move, I usually start from the bottom towards the tail and go up. And that's because sort of over here by the neck, the bones are much bigger and stronger, and so it's a little bit harder to get it out. So I find that if I get it out on the bottom first, it'll be easier to kind of force it out later. And again, if anyone has any questions or anything while I'm doing this, feel free to ask. So now I can feel, maybe you can see over here, there's a little bit of a depression over here. So most of the herring has kind of come out. Sorry, most of the backbone has kind of come out. Oops, just going to do that. Finish that up. And now let's flip it over and see. So this is what we have right now. You can kind of see the backbone over here. It looks like it's a little bit stuck to the meat. So I'm going to try and be careful when I pull it out. Yeah. Oops. Okay. Again, it's not a big deal if you take out a little bit of the meat with you. Don't stress about it too much. You're still going to have plenty. But you can see that I've been able to get it out relatively cleanly. There's a little bit of meat on here, but it's not too bad. And again, you can see the bones, the big bones over here at the top, rather. Yeah, the big bones. I don't know if you can see those. But the ones over here are sort of much longer and more robust. And so those are going to have sort of a firmer hold. So you really want to get this out slowly and not yank it. Okay. And that's it. We have the backbone out. So as you can see, there's a little bit of meat sort of along here and sort of throughout, but really we've gotten it out pretty cleanly. We haven't taken out too much with us. So that's what we're looking for, right? The goal of this is to just get the backbone out while taking out as little of the meat with it as we can. And as we can see over here, if we look at the whole fillet, a little bit of the meat's kind of hanging out over here, but most of it has stayed on pretty nice. So again, it doesn't matter too much since we're just going to cut it up anyway, but we want to try and keep as much as we can together. Right, so the important thing is with this, you're going to notice that there's a bunch of smaller bones that are still on the side, right? You can see that I just pulled them out. You don't need to worry too much about that. They're small and they'll soften up as the herring pickles, and so you're actually not going to be able to taste it at all. What you really just want to make sure is to get these big bones at the top out. Sometimes there's a couple that are hanging out, in particular by the neck, right over here. There's a lot of small bones that are stuck in there. Honestly, I'm just going to cut off another inch or so because it really doesn't matter. That's just like mostly bone, and it's not worth it for me to like pick that stuff out. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just sort of cut the edges off, so we have nice fillets. Oops. And as you do this, I don't know if you could hear that, but there were some bones that were crunching there. So there are still going to be a couple of the bigger bones that I'm going to pick out. I don't know if you can see that really, but again, doesn't matter too much. It's all gonna sort of get nice and soft as we pickle it. So again, cut off the other side over here. And like I said, just to get the worst of the big bones out, just going to cut a little more off the top. If you really want to pick them out again, you can, but it's not worth it. Oh, can you use the tail, head bones, or anything for stock? So I never have. I usually just toss them. I'm not sure. I guess you could make, maybe you could make like a garum or something, which is like a Roman fermented fish paste, kind of like fish sauce. But that's sort of a highfalutin thing. I really don't know. I usually just throw it out, but I don't know how great it would be for a fish stock because it's kind of a delicate fish, but I never really make fish stock anyway. So honestly, I don't know about that. Right, so I'm just going to cut this in half. And then we have two nice fillets. So you can see the skin is still on over here. I'm not going to bother peeling it. It's not really worth it. Again, I kind of like the look of it when it's not peeled. There Again, over here, see there's still a couple of small bones that are in there, but you don't need to worry about those. Okay, and then we're going to slice that up over here into small pieces. Oops, seems like there's a couple of bones still. Doesn't matter. All right, so there's 1/2 done. This one needs a little bit more sort of roughed up by taking out the backbone, but again, not so bad. So here we have our pieces, and now we're going to pickle them. So let me see. I have my jar over here, my handy pickling jar. So this is gonna take only like a couple of days. So you don't need to bother with like the whole canning and sterilizing processes because by the time bacteria would be able to get in, as long as it's sort of in brine, the herring would have gone bad anyway. So you don't need to bother sterilizing, no boiling or anything. You can just plop the herring into the jar and close it up. All right. So before we do that, we're also going to put a little bit of onion. Oops. A little bit of onion, which I should have put before. So that's just going to give it a little nice oniony flavor, and also you'll get some pickled onions as well, which will go nice with the herring when you eat it. My hands are a little bit full of herring. You really don't need too much. I usually put about 1/2 an onion. I'm going to be using the rest of the onion for something else. So I'll put in a little bit less, and you'll see that it'll be plenty. This 1 second. Again, of course, you can use the onion peels, the layers that you're not using. You can just save those, use them for stock. Whether you can use the fish bones, again, I'm not really sure, but something to look into. All right. So here we have our onion. That's fine. Okay, so I'm going to cut this in half. Oops. Okay, and like I said, I'm going to use about 1/4 of this, and I'm just going to slice it up into thin rings. Not used to cutting sitting down, so excuse me. There. All right, that should be enough, honestly. So now we're just going to put the herring in and layer the onion on top. So what you really want is for the herring to be firm. Like I said, it gets mushy pretty quickly. It's still edible if it's a little bit mushy. It's just slightly less pleasant. So really, the best thing to do, excuse me, is just as soon as you get home, take it out, fillet it, pop it in, and that'll keep it nice and firm. All right, so I'm just layering. Ooh, crying here. I'm just layering here the onions with the herring, and then earlier, right? So that's all there. Then earlier, I prepared a brine, which I'll put the recipe for. But basically, I just took some water, a bit of salt and sugar, some peppercorns, some bay leaves, and a couple of cloves. Put them all in, brought them to a boil to make sure everything got mixed up, and then I waited for it to come down to room temperature. Again, be patient. You want to make sure that it comes down to room temperature. If you put it, I've put it in when it's still a little bit warm, and that's a good way to make the herring mushy too, which you want to avoid. So I'm going to get that.
Herring is commonly referred to as too oily for fish, but there are certain recipes for it. From the fact that
So here's our broth over here. I don't know if anyone can see, or our brine rather. I don't know if you can see that, but I got a couple of bay leaves, just a couple of cloves, just a couple of peppercorns. You need fewer. You need fewer than you think to make it really flavorful. Oops, making a mess over here. Again, just enough to fill it. If you don't use it all, that's fine. You can make the same amount of brine, which uses 1 liter of water for 2 herrings. The point is just to cover it. All right, so here is the recipe for the brine. Right, and that's it. Just close that up. pop it in the fridge. It should be good to eat in probably about 2 days or so, 2 or 3 days. It'll continue to build flavor, and then it'll probably be good for a couple of weeks. Then after that, it'll just start to get mushy and quite salty. Sorry, I'm just taking the peppercorns and the cloves that got left in the brine and putting them over here. And that's all it takes to make pickled herring. Enjoy your jar. I'm going to go, just so you can see, I'm going to go get some herring that I made about a week and a half ago. So here's what it looks like. You can see that the pickling liquid has gotten quite cloudy, but that doesn't matter. Again, as long as it's not too salty and not too mushy, it'll still be good. All right, let's see. So here, I don't know if you can see, but this is really, really nice and firm, and it's held up well. It's so good. So the salt really like hits you. If you're not used to that, that can be quite bracing. But you get, a little bit of the cloves with it, a little bit of the pepper, a little bit of bay leaf. It's just like a really nice flavor. It's not overly powerful. It's not overly sour or anything. It's just very good. And I really like this with herring and potatoes, which is a Russian dish of some sort. Basically, what you do is that you take the herring. Takes a piece of herring, you fry up some potatoes with a bit of salt and pepper in sunflower oil, make them golden brown, eat them together. It's a perfect combination. The saltiness and the coldness of the herring just matches really, really well with the sort of golden fried potatoes. So I really recommend doing that. Oops. So that's pickled herring. Is the flavor similar to any other foods? Not really, honestly. Yeah, so it doesn't have a smoked flavor like smoked fish. It definitely has sort of the saltiness of like a really of certain kinds of lobster smoked fish, just without the sort of smokiness. It's also a little bit less maybe creamy. How would I describe it? Yeah, I think probably the closest thing would be sort of the saltiness and the fishiness of smoked fish, but just obviously, like I said, without sort of the smoky bits. Yeah, sort of like raw blocks. Okay, so if anyone has any questions or thoughts about the pickled herring, let me know now. Otherwise, we can move on to the Forshmak, which again is sort of this kind of like herring paste that we'll make, this herring spread. Really, really kind of unfamiliar, really nice. So one thing we do for the Forshmak, this recipe calls for taking the herring, the whole herring, salting it for 2 days. And this is, again, from Café Jerusalem, the restaurant in Lviv. So it's you put it in salt water for 2 days, not to pickle it, just to sort of brine it, to get it salted. Then you rinse that off. You fillet the fish as before. In this case, you're going to want to take the skin off because we're gonna grind it up. And then this is sort of an interesting part. You're going to put it in cold, very strong black tea. And so I just do that. We're going to let that sit for about, we should do it for about 10 minutes. We'll maybe do it for 5 minutes or so. So I don't know if you can see over here. It's a little dark, but we have it in this sort of very dark tea. The other thing we're going to have to do, which is interesting, which I've already done, is we take 2 slices of white bread. Whoops, spilling a little bit. 2 slices of white bread and let them soak in a mixture of water and vinegar. So again, I just did that before. You can do it pretty easily yourself. Just clean that up. All right. So for this, we're going to take the rest of the onion. Just chop it enough to get into the food processor. And we're also going to take an apple, do the same thing. Oops, I still have half the onion. All right, so my food processor is pretty small and I have a bunch of books behind me. So I'm going to do this in stages. I don't want everything to spray everywhere, as happened when I was making a marinade a couple days ago. So I'm going to start, I'm going to really do this in stages. Okay, here's our food processor. So this is going to be a little bit loud, excuse me. So you can do this all together if you have a sort of capacity for it. I'm just going to do it in stages. So this over here is sunflower oil. Again, an ingredient that maybe is not used so much in sort of American cooking influenced by Western European styles, but is very common in Russian and Eastern European cooking. It has a flavor. It's not a very strong flavor. It can be really overpowering sometimes. It has a taste. How would I describe it? It has a taste that can definitely sort of interfere if you want like a clean taste. But for something like this, it's going to add a really nice sort of low level to it. So I'm going to pour a little bit in just so I can mix up the onion. And again, we're going to do this in stages just because I have a small food processor. All right, that's that. I'm going to do the rest of the onion over here. Ooh, tearing up. Strong onions. Okay. So now I'm going to cut the apple. Again, you can cut it into just 4 or 16 pieces, just sort of roughly, just to make sure that the food processor can handle it. I'm worried about my food processor being able to handle it, so I'm going to cut it up kind of small. But it's all going to get chopped up anyway, so this part doesn't matter too much. I should have had a smaller knife for this. Okay. And again, just take that, chop it up. And let's mix this so it doesn't get overwhelmed. I realize now that I made a mistake in not peeling the apple. So when you do it at home, make sure to do that. But whatever. It's not the end of the world. I'll have these sort of apple peel bits that I can strain out. I'm not trained in removing apple peels from this, so it happens. Don't worry too much about it. All right. So now we have our onion and our apple together in a nice paste. And actually, let me put the recipe in here so you can follow along. Okay, so there's the recipe for Forshmak if you want to see what we're doing. Right, so we have the apple and the onion in there. I'm also going to add a handful of walnuts. Let's do around there. Sorry, I don't really have more precise measurements than this. Just play around with it, make it to your liking. Right, so we have the apple, the onion, a bit of walnuts. We're going to put in the white bread that we've been soaking in vinegar and water. Oops. Okay. Again, this is starting to get kind of full, so I'm going to mix it up again. So everything's soft now, so it's not too big of a deal. Oops, not too worried about it. Okay, so that's all mixed up anyway. So I think we can take the herring out now. I'm just going to get move some of this into another bowl so we can have room for the herring. Again, this is strictly for convenience sake. The goal is just to get a paste where everything's mixed up. Oops. Yeah, especially with the apple, the little bits of apple peel that I forgot to take out. The texture is maybe, or the look is maybe not the most appealing. It's just sort of a white paste, but it'll taste really good. Okay. So I think we're about ready to take the herring out. Again, it's been soaking in tea, very, very strong tea, for a few minutes now. And here's what we have. Tastes sort of a little salty and tea-like. Interesting. You can put that in. You could probably wash it off if you want. I'm not going to bother. And again, for these, I'm not worrying too much about taking out the small bones because it's all just going to get mixed up anyway. All right, so we've nestled our herring fillets in there nicely. Again, I'm going to take a little bit more out, just so we have some more room. The herring is pretty soft. I'm not too worried about it. All right. Looks like it is all mixed up now. So I'm just going to take it out, put it into my bowl over here. Okay. Oops. So that's the basic paste. The basic spread, rather. It's a little more appealing when I call it a spread. All we have to do now is just add a few more things. In particular, now that it's mixed well, we just want to combine it with a lot of sunflower oil and white vinegar, and also salt and pepper. So I'm going to taste it first, and then we'll add some things to it. So it needs a little bit of time to come together. The onion is obviously quite strong. I'm going to try and cut that a little bit. But it's good. Let's try that. Again, I don't really have amounts that are too specific, which I know can be frustrating. But, you know, just do it to taste. Do what feels right. Everybody sort of has their own amounts. Start by adding a little bit at a time of each of these things, then add more until it works. So let's start with that. Again, we can mix that all up. So this is about the consistency you want. I don't know if you can see it. It's quite loose. It's not really lumpy, but it's also not really watery yet. You don't want it to get all the way to watery. I'm going to taste a little bit more. So the sweetness of the apple works really nicely with the bit of herring that you taste and the sharpness of the onion. Add a little bit more sunflower oil, some vinegar too. So a note on the pepper. I like to add a lot of pepper, and in general, this sort of cuisine uses pepper quite liberally as sort of what I would call kind of a real spice in a way that I think I usually don't when I'm cooking. When I'm cooking just sort of like Western European traditional foods, right? There weren't too many spices. You're going to get a lot of kind of herby things, maybe some marjoram, a lot of dill, things like that. But you don't really get, the wide array of spices that we see in like Indian cuisine or something, for example, right? So the pepper can really be used if you add enough of it and it's nice and fresh for a spice. It's really good now. It's a lot of pepper in here. I'm even going to add a little bit more salt. And you probably want to wait a little bit of time for all the flavors to come together. But you can really, really taste each thing sort of contributing in separately again, right? You have the sweetness of the apples, so sort of bolstered by a little bit of walnut. You get kind of the fishiness of the herring and the saltiness of the herring. Excuse me, cut with a little acid from the vinegar. When done well, it's really nice, and it's not even too fishy, right? So the pickled herring is quite fishy and quite salty. If you're looking to try herring, sort of try and get into this kind of cuisine, but you're a little bit worried about the fishiness, the Forshmak would be a really good thing to do because it's not quite as fishy. So that's about it. This is done. I'm just going to enjoy this on some nice black bread, and it goes very well, obviously, with a little bit of vodka as well. Oops, sorry. All right. So I got my black bread over here. I'm going to pour myself a little bit of vodka. That's a delicious way to spend a Thursday evening. Thank you. Where's my spoon? Just spread this on. I don't think we have any half-sour pickles, but this goes really well with pickles too. Any kind of pickled things, pickled tomatoes, pickled beets, pickled cabbage, it'll all be great. All goes really well together. Cheers. So if anyone has any questions about herring or things related to herring, I'd be happy to talk about that. If anyone has any thoughts, we have a few minutes left. That's about all I got. So thank you. So I haven't ever heard of vegetarian Forshmak. So the part of the world where this cuisine comes from, obviously, is still quite meat heavy, and people, I think there's, vegetarianism is not really that widespread. I don't know what some of the flavors would go well together. I don't know what you would replace the herring with. You could do maybe there's something called like vegetarian caviar. It's like an eggplant paste. They're both called ikra in Russian, sort of the same word used for caviar in this, or something like that. For this eggplant paste. So that might be used to replace kind of caviar, which also has like a salty, fishy flavor. So if you tried replacing the herring with that, that might work well. I will say, though, it's not entirely true that this part of the world doesn't have a tradition of vegetarianism. I do want to plug here, there's this fantastic cookbook. There was a Jewish woman who lived in Vilna, in Vilnius, in Lithuania, or what is now Lithuania, rather, sort of before the Second World War. Her name was Fania Levando. That's, I'll write that. Oops. So she was a Jewish woman living in Vilna with a lot of other Jews. It was a big Jewish town. And she wrote this vegetarian, I imagine also kosher, this vegetarian cookbook. I think it's available in English. I'm not totally sure. But there will be a lot of good vegetarian recipes that sort of come from that tradition in Fania Levando's cookbook. So if you can track down a copy of that, which I think is in English, you'll definitely be able to find something that it might not be labeled vegetarian Forshmak, but you might be able to get a lot of the same flavor profiles. In particular, obviously, there's going to be a lot of pickled things, a lot of things, even using this this technique of kind of like soaking old bread and putting it in with a mixture, because that was sort of a very good way of saving money and sort of making your things go further, your money go further, your resources go further, rather. All right, so let me find a link to this cookbook, which I should be able to pull up. Let me see. Okay. Yeah, okay. The Vilna Vegetarian Cookbook is what it's called. I think it was just rediscovered a few years ago. I haven't actually looked through it. I'm familiar with the work a little bit, so I don't know really what's in there. Only a couple of recipes, but from what I understand, it's really amazing. It's really sort of like a great artifact of this this time when you wouldn't really expect, too much food. Obviously, you do have with kosher food a separation between meat and dairy, so you can get a lot. There is a place for a lot of vegetarian recipes. So yeah, there actually were quite a few, but without fish as well, probably not too common from cuisine, especially non-Jewish cuisine around that time. So I think this is a really great thing. All right, we got a couple of minutes left, so if anyone has any other questions, again, just let me know. Happy to hear your thoughts. Yeah, glad to help. Thank you. For what? Oh, in the brine. I don't know, honestly. So I just made it taste really, really salty. The recipe calls for it to salt it for 2 days, and I only had about 8 hours. So I actually poured in enough salt for a wooden spoon to float in it. If it's 2 days, I don't know. I would probably just make something similar to, actually no, probably like quite a bit more salt than what I did for the pickling liquid. But unfortunately, I don't know too much. I don't think it matters too much. It's going to take a couple of days to sort of. I'm not an expert on this. There might be something specific that you should have, but like given that you're adding salt later in addition, it doesn't really matter too much because you can just adjust the amount of salt you have later based on how salty the fish is. So I wouldn't worry about it too much. Just sort of enough to give it like a good salting. You also want to rinse the fish off before you fillet it, I should say as well. I think I put that in the recipe. Any other thoughts or questions? All right, so I think we can wrap it up now. Thanks so much to everyone for coming. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you'll be making your own pickled herring and other herring dishes in the future. And enjoy the rest of the weekend.